2035, official Chinese planning calls for the basic model of a lunar research station in the lunar South Pole region. That matters because China is no longer just running separate lunar missions. It is building a sequence, and each step is designed to make the next one possible. China's moon program is about infrastructure, not flags. In an earlier SpaceWatch analysis, we looked at how physical presence on the moon could shape long-term strategy. This time, the focus is narrower. The question is how China is building that presence step by step. Because what can look like a string of missions is actually something more structured. It is a sequence. China is not repeating Apollo, it is building toward a system. The shift starts with how the program is organized. Earlier lunar missions were still framed primarily around exploration, orbiting the moon, landing, and returning samples. Those steps built technical confidence and proved that China could operate across the mission chain, but they were still individual achievements. They demonstrated capability, but they did not yet create continuity. China's own program framing has increasingly pointed beyond isolated milestones toward the next phase of a longer lunar build. Recent official planning connects exploration more directly to operations. Instead of only asking what each mission discovers, the program increasingly points toward what each mission enables next. That shift is subtle, but it is critical. It turns a sequence of missions into a sequence of dependencies, and that leads directly to the South Pole. The South Pole is not a symbolic target, it is an operational one. The region is attractive because it is associated with long-term surface utility. Permanently shadowed areas matter for water-ice questions, while nearby terrain is often discussed in relation to more favorable illumination conditions. The terrain is difficult and operations there are not simple, but the South Pole region matters because it is tied to the possibility of sustained activity rather than one-off visits. So the program moves there with purpose. Chang'e-7 is the first major step in that direction. Official Chinese framing places it around surveys of the lunar South Pole region and resource-related investigation. Those are not just scientific questions, they are operational inputs. Before later missions can test utilization or support a more durable presence, the program first has to understand the environment it wants to work in. Chang'e-7 matters because it helps define that operating picture in greater detail. The next step is Chang'e-8, where the program begins to move from confirmation toward use. Official Chinese planning ties Chang'e-8 to scientific exploration and in-situ resource utilization experiments that would help test whether local materials can support later operations. That is the key shift. The mission is not just about learning more, it is about beginning to test whether parts of a surface support logic can work under lunar conditions. The exact outcomes are not fixed yet, and not every element has been demonstrated. But the direction is clear. Chang'e-7 helps clarify the South Pole environment and resource picture. Chang'e-8 begins pushing toward utilization experiments. That transition matters because it changes the program's purpose. Once a mission begins testing utilization, it is no longer only exploring. It is starting to ask whether presence can be supported, not just achieved. And these missions are not isolated. Official Chinese sources describe both Chang'e-7 and Chang'e-8 as parts of the basic model of the International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS, targeted for completion by 2035 in the lunar South Pole region. Chinese officials say that the basic model is intended to include capabilities such as Earth-Moon transportation, energy supply, communication, navigation, scientific exploration, and ground support functions with in-situ resource utilization integrated into the broader system. That is what makes the program infrastructure-driven. None of these layers is decisive on its own. The significance is in how they connect. because infrastructure is not defined by one system. It is defined by how systems connect, and the sequencing becomes clearer when you look at it this way. First, you improve the environmental and resource picture. Then, you test early utilization logic. Then, you begin assembling the supporting layers that could allow operations to continue over time. That is a very different program logic from a single symbolic landing. Once the program shifts from exploration to usable surface operations, human access stops being a separate prestige milestone and becomes the next operational layer. That is where the crewed lunar program fits. China continues to describe its goal as a crewed lunar landing before 2030. The architecture is based on a two-launch approach. One launch sends the crew spacecraft Mengzhao, and another sends the lunar lander, Lanyue, into lunar orbit where they rendezvous and dock before the landing sequence begins. That matters because a crewed architecture raises the demands on the rest of the system. Operations become more continuous. Decisions move closer to the surface. Infrastructure matters more because systems have to work together under real conditions rather than only in planned mission windows. So the robotic missions and the crewed missions are not separate stories. They are parts of the same structure. Chang'e-7 helps define the environment. Chang'e-8 begins testing whether local resources can support later activity. The crewed program adds human access to that environment, and the ILRS basic model is the framework intended to connect those layers into something more durable. If you look at it only as a race, you miss the logic. If you look at it as infrastructure, the logic becomes visible. Infrastructure is not built in one step. It is layered, and each layer depends on the previous one working well enough to support the next. That also explains why the timeline matters. The 2035 ILRS basic model target implies a roughly decade-long move from environmental confirmation toward early operational capability in one region. The point is not one moment, the point is continuity. That continuity matters because operational advantage is rarely created by one successful landing. It emerges when transport, communications, surface access, and resource experiments begin to reinforce one another in the same region. At that point, present stops being symbolic and starts becoming cumulative. This is also why caution matters. The system is not complete. Many elements are not yet demonstrated at full scale. Chang'e-7 has not yet completed its mission. Chang'e-8 has not yet carried out those utilization experiments on the lunar surface. The crewed landing has not yet taken place, and the ILRS basic model remains a projected architecture rather than an operating reality. But the sequencing is visible, and that sequencing is what matters. Because once a program follows a structured path like this, each mission adds more than data. It adds position. It builds familiarity with terrain and operating conditions. It increases readiness for the next layer. Over time, that accumulation changes what becomes feasible. This is also why the South Pole remains the focus, not because it is visually dramatic, but because it is operationally valuable. If systems begin to take shape there, the South Pole region becomes more than a destination. It becomes a node in a larger operating framework. If you value space analysis built around how lunar capability is actually assembled, not just how it is announced, subscribe to SpaceWatch, because what matters here is not the headline of the next mission, but how each layer enables the next. China is not just returning to the moon. It is building a path toward operating there. Each mission is tied to the next. Each capability feeds forward. That is the logic of infrastructure. If transport, energy, communication, navigation, surface work, and eventually resource-linked support begin to come together in one region, then the moon stops being a place you visit. It becomes a place where you operate. And once that shift begins, the strategic picture changes, because presence is no longer defined by a landing. It is defined by the system that supports it. The real question is whether this sequence allows China to establish a usable lunar operating framework before any comparable system is in place.